I walked into my kitchen after my first round of chemotherapy, poison still coursing through my veins, to find my husband Mark waiting for me with a manila envelope. Divorce papers. Filed that morning while I was hooked up to an IV, fighting for my life. Mark thought he was leaving a weak, broken woman behind. He had no idea that the woman he was abandoning had already outmaneuvered him at every turn. You see, cancer didn't make me weak. It made me strategic. It made me ruthless. And by the time he realized what I'd done, it was far too late. Before we dive into the story, I have a quick favor to ask. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing how far our stories reach. And if this is your first time here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We drop new videos every single day. Now, let's get back to the story. My name is Mabel, I'm 33 years old, and this is the story of how my husband's betrayal became his complete destruction. I met Mark when I was 25. He was 31 then, already climbing the corporate ladder at a prestigious consulting firm. Charming, ambitious, successful, everything I thought I wanted in a partner. He swept me off my feet with expensive dinners and weekend getaways. Within 2 years, we were married. Within 5, I thought we had built something unbreakable. I was an only child, and my parents had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, one of the reasons Mark and I had grown closer initially. He'd been my rock during that devastating time, which made his current betrayal cut even deeper. I had a few close friends, but they lived in different cities, pursuing their own careers and lives. Mark had been my primary support system, my emergency contact, the person I'd built my entire adult life around. Maybe that's why I'd been so blind to the warning signs. When you only have one person to rely on, you make excuses for their behavior, because facing the truth means facing the possibility of being completely alone. I was wrong about thinking our marriage was unbreakable. The cracks didn't appear overnight. They started small, missed dinners, canceled plans, that distant look in his eyes when he thought I wasn't watching. Mark worked in mergers and acquisitions, and his job demanded long hours, frequent travel, and constant networking. At least, that's what he told me. I worked as a financial analyst at a mid-sized investment firm. The irony wasn't lost on me. I spent my days analyzing other people's financial moves, spotting patterns, identifying risks. Skills that would prove invaluable later. For the first few years of our marriage, we talked about having children. We tried for over 2 years, went through fertility testing, even considered IVF. But nothing happened. The doctors said everything looked normal, that sometimes these things just take time. Mark grew increasingly frustrated with each negative pregnancy test, each failed cycle. Looking back, I wonder if that's when he started seeing me as defective, as someone who couldn't give him what he wanted. The first real red flag came about 8 months before my diagnosis. Mark started mentioning Emily more frequently. Emily, 26, a junior associate at his firm. Fresh out of business school, ambitious, and according to Mark, brilliant. She worked directly under him on several high-profile accounts. Emily suggested we restructure the Johnson deal, he'd say over dinner. Emily found an error in the Peterson contract that saved us millions. Always Emily, always praise, always delivered with just a little too much enthusiasm. I started paying attention. The late-night texts that he'd flip his phone over to hide. The weekend, strategy sessions that seemed to multiply. The sudden interest in going to the gym, updating his wardrobe, switching to a cologne I'd never smelled before. Classic signs, textbook even, but I didn't confront him. Instead, I did what I do best. I analyzed, I watched, I documented. In November, 3 months before my diagnosis, I hired a private investigator. Margaret, a former police detective who specialized in marital infidelity. She was thorough, professional, and discreet. Within 2 weeks, she had enough evidence to end 10 marriages. Hotel receipts, restaurant bills, security footage of them entering and leaving the Marriott downtown. Gift deliveries to Emily's, flowers, jewelry, expensive lingerie. The evidence was overwhelming, but I wanted more. I needed to know what they were saying about me. The opportunity came 2 weeks later. Mark had been drinking at an after-work happy hour and came home tipsy, something that rarely happened. He stumbled into bed, plugged in his phone, and passed out without setting his usual passcode lock. I waited until I heard him snoring, then carefully took his hand and used his fingerprint to unlock the phone. What I found made my stomach churn. Conversations where Mark called me boring and high maintenance, where Emily joked about my constant doctor visits, the routine checkups that would soon reveal something far more serious than either of them realized. They mocked my concern about irregular periods and the small lump I'd found during a self-exam. "Mabel's always worried about something," Mark had texted. "Drama queen mode activated again." In another message, he'd written, "At least if she can't have kids, she won't pass on the hypochondriac gene." Emily had responded with a laughing emoji. That text was dated January 15th. On January 18th, my gynecologist referred me to an oncologist. On January 22nd, I got the call that changed everything. Breast cancer. Stage 2B aggressive. Treatment would need to start immediately. I called Mark from the parking lot of the medical center, sobbing so hard I could barely speak. "I know what you're thinking, why would I call him? I already knew about Emily. I'd seen the evidence. I'd read the cruel messages. But cancer changes everything." In that moment, terrified and alone, I wasn't thinking like the strategic woman who'd hired a private investigator. I was thinking like a wife who just received a death sentence and desperately needed her husband, the man I'd loved for 7 years, despite everything, to show up for me. Maybe it was weakness. Maybe it was hope. Maybe I thought that something this serious would cut through his selfishness and remind him of who we used to be. He was in a meeting, he said. Could this wait? When I finally managed to tell him, through tears, that I had cancer, there was silence. Then a sigh. Then words that cut deeper than any scalpel ever could. "First, you can't even give me children. And now you have breast cancer. I married a healthy woman, not a patient. I can't believe this." Even knowing what I knew about him, the cruelty of it took my breath away. After years of failed attempts at pregnancy, after countless doctor visits and treatments, he was throwing our infertility in my face while I was dealing with a cancer diagnosis. This wasn't just the Mark who was cheating. This was someone I'd never seen before. Someone capable of kicking me when I was already destroyed. He hung up. Didn't come home that night. Didn't call. Didn't text. I sat in our bed, staring at the ceiling, holding the business card for the oncologist who would try to save my life, and the painful truth crystallized. I'd been hoping that somewhere underneath the affair, underneath the betrayal, there was still the man I'd married. The man who would put aside his selfishness when his wife was literally fighting for her life. I was wrong. And that realization, that even cancer couldn't bring back the husband I'd once loved, was almost more devastating than the diagnosis itself. Mark came home the following night, finally. No apology, no explanation, just a casual, "Hey," like he'd been running errands instead of abandoning his wife on the worst day of her life. He made himself dinner, didn't ask if I'd eaten. He watched TV, didn't ask how I was feeling. He went to bed, didn't even look at me. Over the next few days, he established a pattern. Leave early, stay late, minimal conversation. When I tried to talk about treatment options, he'd change the subject. When I mentioned needing someone to drive me to appointments, he'd suddenly remember important meetings. "Can't Emily handle the Patel account?" I asked one evening, watching him pack his laptop bag for another late night at the office. His hand froze on the zipper. "Emily's just an associate. She doesn't have the experience for something that complex. But she's brilliant, right? That's what you're always telling me. What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing, just wondering why someone so brilliant can't handle more responsibility." He left without another word. And I smiled for the first time in days. After a week of watching Mark's cold, distant behavior, after seeing him prioritize everything except his wife who was about to start fighting for her life, I made the decision that would change everything. That night, I called Margaret and told her to end her investigation and compile every piece of evidence she had found. I needed everything, and I needed it fast. My first chemo session was scheduled for the following Monday. If Mark was going to abandon me, I wanted to be ready. Margaret delivered on Friday. A thick folder full of evidence that painted a picture of betrayal so complete, so calculated, that I almost admired its thoroughness. Hotel records going back 6 months. Credit card statements showing expensive dinners, jewelry purchases, even a weekend trip to Napa that Mark had told me was a client retreat. The photographs were the worst part. Mark and Emily entering hotel rooms. Kissing in restaurant booths. his hand on her lower back as they walked through the lobby of the Ritz-Carlton. In one photo, she's wearing a necklace I'd never seen before, a delicate gold chain with a heart pendant. In another, Mark is laughing at something she's said, his face showing more joy than I'd seen in months. The morning before my first chemo session, I made 2 calls, first to Cora Walsh, a divorce attorney. "Cora, it's Mabel. I need to see you as soon as possible." "Yes, it's urgent." Cora was the divorce attorney I'd consulted after Mark's first major betrayal, when I'd found flirty text messages with a client about 2 years ago. Nothing had come of it then, but I'd kept her card. Now I was glad I had. The second call was the most important. I dialed the main number for Mark's company, asked to be transferred to Human Resources, and requested a meeting. "This is regarding a potential violation of company policy," I told the receptionist. "It's regarding a senior executive and a direct report. I have documentation." They scheduled me for Monday morning, the same day as my first chemo session. I spent the day preparing, not just for chemotherapy, but for the systematic destruction of my husband's life. Because if Mark thought he could abandon me in my darkest hour, he was about to learn that he'd picked the wrong woman to underestimate. Monday morning arrived like a reckoning. I had 2 appointments that would determine the rest of my life, my first chemotherapy session at 11 and my meeting with HR at 9. I chose my outfit carefully, professional but not overly formal. A woman who meant business but wasn't trying to intimidate. I carried a leather portfolio containing copies of every piece of evidence Margaret had gathered, organized chronologically and cross-referenced by date. The HR director, Patricia Thompson, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had seen every kind of workplace drama imaginable. She greeted me with polite professionalism, but I could see the curiosity in her eyes. "Mrs. Bennett, you mentioned documentation regarding a policy violation." I opened my portfolio. "My husband, Mark Bennett, has been having an affair with his direct report, Emily Cooper, for approximately 8 months. I slid the first photograph across the table. Mark and Emily entering a hotel room, timestamp clearly visible. Patricia's expression didn't change, but I saw her posture shift slightly. "This is concerning. What other documentation do you have?" For the next 30 minutes, I laid out everything. Hotel receipts charged to company credit cards, restaurant bills from client meetings that were actually romantic dinners, gift deliveries to Emily's home address, text messages showing Mark's preferential treatment of Emily on projects, giving her opportunities that other junior associates weren't offered. But the most damaging evidence was what came next. Among the screenshots I'd taken from Mark's phone were forwarded company emails where he'd shared confidential client information with Emily outside of normal channels. Budget details, strategy documents, merger plans, all sent to her personal number via text message attachments. "He's been treating her like a partner rather than a subordinate," I said. Patricia was taking notes now, her pen moving rapidly across the legal pad. "How did you obtain these communications?" "Through legal means during documentation of marital infidelity. I'm not asking you to take action based on personal grievances. I'm alerting you to professional misconduct that could cost your company millions if it goes public." Patricia set down her pen. "Mrs. Bennett, I need to ask, what outcome are you seeking here?" I replied, "Justice, accountability, and protection for other employees who might be affected by this abuse of power." "And this has nothing to do with your marital situation?" she asked. I met her eyes directly. "My marriage is over. That's a personal matter. This is about professional ethics and company liability. I'm bringing this to your attention because it's the right thing to do." She nodded slowly. "We'll need to conduct a full investigation. This could take several weeks." "I understand. I've provided copies of everything. The originals are with my attorney." "Your attorney?" "For the divorce proceedings, which, again, are separate from this matter." I stood to leave, but Patricia had one more question. "Mrs. Bennett, why now? Why are you coming forward at this particular time?" I paused at the door. "Because I recently received some news that put everything in perspective. Life is short. Too short to let people get away with betraying the trust placed in them." I left the building and drove straight to the cancer center. By the time I checked in for my appointment, I felt stronger than I had in months. The poison they were about to pump into my veins was nothing compared to the poison I just delivered to Mark's career. The chemo session was brutal. 3 hours of nausea, fatigue, and the metallic taste that would haunt me for days. I sat there alone, watching other patients with their spouses, their children, their friends. The nurse, Edith, was kind and kept checking on me, but it wasn't the same as having someone who loved you holding your hand through the worst of it. But I endured it, knowing that across town, Mark was about to face his own kind of treatment. I got home that evening to find him already there, which was unusual. He was in the kitchen, still in his work clothes, staring at his phone with an expression I'd never seen before. "Mabel, we need to talk." I set down my purse, noting the manila envelope on the counter. "About what?" "About us, about our marriage, about this situation." "You mean my cancer?" He winced at the word. "About everything. I think we both know this isn't working anymore." I looked at the envelope again. "Is that what you wanted to talk about?" "I've filed for divorce. I think it's best for both of us." The papers were already prepared. He'd filed them that morning while I was hooked up to an IV. The irony was so perfect I almost laughed. "Irreconcilable differences," I read from the documents. "That's what you're calling it." "Mabel, I can't do this. I can't be married to someone who's sick. I can't handle the hospitals, the treatments, the uncertainty. I need to be able to live my life." "With Emily," his face went white. "What? Did you think I didn't know? Did you think I was so distracted that I wouldn't notice my husband was screwing his coworker?" "Mabel, Save it. I already know everything. The hotels, the dinners, the gifts, the jokes about my health. The way you've been treating me like an inconvenience while you build your new life with someone else." He sat down heavily at the kitchen table. "How long have you known?" "Months. I've been watching you dig your own grave, and now you've finally jumped in." "What's that supposed to mean?" I smiled then, and it felt like the first genuine smile I'd had in weeks. "It means you should probably call your boss. I think you'll have very interesting days to look forward to." The next few weeks unfolded like a perfectly choreographed dance of destruction. Mark's world didn't just crumble, it imploded with the precision of a controlled demolition. The HR investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Within days, Emily was transferred to a different department. Mark was suspended pending a full review. The company's ethics board, demonstrate their commitment to workplace integrity, seized on the case as a perfect example. But the real damage came from the financial audit that followed. Mark's expense reports, which had seemed legitimate individually, revealed a pattern of abuse when examined collectively. Hundreds of thousands in questionable charges. Client dinners that were romantic getaways. Business travel that included personal expenses. Company resources used for personal gain. The irony was beautiful. Mark, who had spent years structuring deals and identifying financial irregularities for clients, had left a paper trail that any first-year auditor could follow. His affair hadn't just been unethical, it had been expensive, and the company wanted every penny back. He was fired on a Tuesday, the same day I had my third chemo session. The divorce proceedings were equally satisfying. Mark had assumed that filing first would give him an advantage, but he'd underestimated the power of documentation. Cora Walsh, my attorney, had been preparing for this moment for months. Every piece of evidence Margaret had gathered was admissible. Every financial transaction was documented. Every lie was exposed. Mark's affair wasn't just grounds for divorce, it was grounds for him to forfeit most of our marital assets. The house, the savings account, the investment portfolio I'd been building for years, all of it stayed with me. His company's stock options, which had been his primary source of wealth, were frozen pending the outcome of the corporate investigation. Emily didn't fare much better. Her transfer became a demotion when her new supervisor realized she'd been promoted beyond her actual qualifications. The professional network she'd been building through her relationship with Mark evaporated overnight. Within 2 months, she'd resigned and left the city entirely. But the most satisfying part wasn't their professional destruction. It was watching Mark realize how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. The man who had called me weak, who had abandoned me in my darkest hour, who had mocked my health concerns while planning his escape, had been defeated by the woman he'd underestimated. As for me, I survived. The chemotherapy was hell, but I endured it. I lost my hair, but it grew back. I lost my husband, but I gained something more valuable, the knowledge that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. The cancer went into remission 6 months after Mark signed the final divorce papers. I celebrated with Margaret and Cora, 2 women who had helped me reclaim my life. We toasted with champagne in the living room of the house that was now entirely mine. Mark moved across the country, taking a job with a mid-tier firm at a fraction of his previous salary. His reputation in the industry was shot. His relationship with Emily hadn't survived the stress of their mutual professional destruction. He was alone, broke, and unemployable at the level he'd grown accustomed to. Sometimes I wonder if he thinks about that night when he told me he'd married a healthy woman, not a patient. I wonder if he realizes that he'd actually married a survivor, not a victim. Someone who would fight for her life with the same intensity she'd fight for justice. Cancer didn't make me weak. It made me ruthless. It stripped away everything unnecessary and left me with pure, focused determination. I'm 33 now, cancer-free, and living my best life. I travel. I've started my own consulting firm. I've begun dating again, a kind, patient man who I met during my treatment. He held my hand through the last few months of checkup and celebrated with me when the tests came back clean. Mark thought he was leaving behind a patient. Instead, he'd crossed a survivor. And survivors, as he learned too late, fight back. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button. And don't forget to share this video and subscribe if you haven't already. We've got more incredible revenge stories coming your way. What would you have done in Mabel's situation? Would you have fought back like she did, or handled things differently? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one.